This video is all about vitamins. There are two types of vitamins. There's fat soluble, and then there's water soluble. Fat soluble vitamins are going to be your vitamin A, D, E, and K, or ADEC. That'll be on our next video. Today we're going to talk about water soluble vitamins. These are going to be everything else. So water soluble vitamins get their name because they're soluble in water. Toxicity with these vitamins are very rare because if you have too much of it, you can just pee them out. However, there are two that are stored a little bit longer because they're very important. That is B9, also known as folate, B12, that is your cobalamin. B9 folate found in leafy greens, stored for a few months, so months. B12 cobalamin is only found in animal products. You need to know that. And is stored for years, so around 2 or 3 years. In the step, they may talk about a patient who is a vegan, or they might give you some sort of time frame of when they stopped eating meat, so a couple of years or a couple of months or a couple of weeks. So you need to know both that B12 is from animal products and that they're stored for a couple of years. So if they just immediately stop eating meat, they're not going to go B12 deficiency all of a sudden. It takes a couple of years for those stores to go down. Those are the two main ones, and those two go together like a horse and carriage. But I'll save that for the end. We'll just start from the top. So B1 thiamine. B1 thiamine. Even before this video, we talked a lot about thiamine. We talked about how it's used in complexes like your alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase complex and your pyruvate dehydrogenase. Remember, those were the 5 subunit complexes that I drew out. It's also found in your branched chain keto acid dehydrogenase. There's a deficiency in that caused maple syrup disease. And then lastly, when we talked about our HMP shunt, we talked about trans ketolase needing thiamine. T for trans ketolase, T for thiamine. Another thing you need to know is that thiamine deficiency, because it's seen in trans ketolase, can be diagnosed either by low trans ketolase activity, or if you give thiamine and then trans ketolase skyrockets, you know the patient's thiamine deficient. You lack thiamine, then these can go out, especially this. Remember, this is in your glycolysis. Glycolysis and your TCA cycle. So lack of thiamine, you're gonna have low ATP. Low ATP. And the things that are affected most by this low ATP will be things like your brain, your heart, things that use a lot of ATP. You might have things wrong with your heart, so dilated cardiomyopathy, heart failure, etc. Things wrong with your brain, neuroscience, such as paralysis or trouble walking. But the most famous of all is Wernicke-Korsakoff. Wernicke-Korsakoff. Traditionally seen in alcoholics that don't take good care of their nutrition. But again, folate's only stored for a couple of months. So if you're not doing well with your folate intake, you can have that. So Wernicke-Korsakoff is broken into Wernicke's and Korsakoff. The most specific sign of Wernicke is atrophy of your mammillary glands. That deals a lot with memory, so patients are going to have memory loss. You're also going to have the classic findings of confusion, ataxia, ophthalmoplegia, where your eyes aren't moving like they should. So that triad is more seen in Wernicke's part of it. The Korsakoff part of it is amnesia, hallucinations, confabulations. So amnesia, confabulations. These are classic findings, classic signs. One thing you should be aware of, if a patient has low thiamine, but he or she's not showing signs of these, they might have low thiamine, but let's say they come in and you give them IV glucose, which is common. When you give them that IV glucose, it'll rev the glycolysis pathway up. It'll use these enzymes and it'll use up whatever last thiamine they have, and you will put them in Wernicke's Korsakoff. IV glucose can cause these if you're not careful. That's why sometimes you'll give IV glucose with thiamine just in case they have low thiamine already. Very important you know that. Seen in a lot of step questions, okay? So that's B1. Let's talk about B2. B2 is your riboflavin. Anything that ends or starts with flavin, think of B2. Deficiencies cause these little cracks in the side of your mouth called chiliosis. Also causes corneal vascularization. Don't really know why. Vascularization. That's it for B2. B3 is your niacin or your nicotinic acid. We talked about niacin earlier. We talked about how tryptophan makes it. So tryptophan makes it. And here's a board question. This is a question I actually got. Talked about what vitamin can help in patients with high lipidemias. So hyperlipidemias, and I didn't really know what they're getting at. We can actually give niacin as medication, and niacin increases HDL through a method that is not really clearly understood. One of the side effects of giving niacin for things like high cholesterol is that side effect seen commonly is flushing. And the flushing is not from histamine, so antihistamines wouldn't do anything. The flushing is from your skin cells releasing a lot of prostaglandins. So prostaglandins. So taking NSAIDs like aspirin would reduce that. Sometimes they just tell you to take NSAIDs with it. That is your B3. The classic findings of deficiency seen in it is diarrhea. Patient will have diarrhea. They also have confusion, short memory loss, dementia. They have dermatitis or skin lesions, commonly in their arms, around their neck. They call that diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, the 3 Ds of B3. So the 3 Ds, again, diarrhea, dementia, dermatitis. And lastly, it can affect the metabolism of sugars, causing hyperglycemia. Also affects uric acid metabolism, causing high uric acid. That is B3. We'll jump now to B6 and clear this side. B6. Which is your pyridoxine. Pyridoxine is essential for these things called transaminase. If you haven't heard of transaminase, these are your A T, and your AST. Bet you've heard of them now. These are not found exclusively in the liver, even though we measure these during liver function tests. These are found almost everywhere. However, because your liver does most of what we've been talking about thus far, they're a good indicator for liver damage. So these are needed for ALT, ASTs, aka transaminases. Also needed for heme synthesis and neurotransmitters. So if you have a deficiency, you won't make heme, you'll have anemia. You won't make neurotransmitters, you'll have neuropathy. Also isoniazid, common TB drug, blocks B6. So you need to give B6 with this drug. Know that well. Let's move on now to B7, biotin. Not much to talk about here. We talked about how all carboxylases need a friend, need biotin. And then the other thing you should know is that eating raw eggs have something called avidin that binds biotin, but that's more of, I guess, theoretical board questions. You'd have to eat dozens of raw eggs to be biotin deficient. But we'll just write it down for completion's sake. So raw eggs can cause deficiency. Next is going to be your B9 and B12. But I'm going to skip that for right now. I'm going to go straight to vitamin C, which is the last water-soluble vitamin we're going to talk about. We're going to jump back to B9 and B12 in a second because they're that important. I want to spend a little bit of extra time talking about them. So I'll jump ahead and talk about vitamin C first. Vitamin C, found in your citrus fruits, delicious. Vitamin C we talked about while making collagen, helps make collagen in the first place. So if you're vitamin C deficient, you get scurvy, bleeding gums. You also get very thin curly hair. It looks kind of like a pig's tail. I've seen questions on the step that just show pictures of a curly hair and it says, what's deficient? It's vitamin C. You don't have to think twice. It's not like a trick question, it's just vitamin C. So they have these little curly corkscrew pigtail-like hair. Vitamin C was also a friend in catecholamine synthesis. Do you remember what step in that synthesis pathway? That was your dopamine to norepi. And then last but not least, it's not the first line treatment, but for treatment of methemoglobinemia, that's when you have oxidized iron that can't bind to oxygen. You can turn that back to normal iron with vitamin C. That does it for vitamin C. We're beating around the bush. Let's finally talk about B9 and B12. So B9 and B12 are very important. And again, I say they go together like a horse and carriage. B9 being your folate, B12 being your cobalamin. B9, folate, absorbed in your jejunum. So any problem with your jejunum, and they say what's deficient in this patient, they're getting at your folate will be deficient. If you have like your jejunum taken out or resected, you won't be able to absorb the folate, you'll be folate deficient. Needed to make nucleic acids. We talked about folate being important in that. When you don't have nucleic acids, it can affect your red blood cell production, causing megaloblastic anemia. That's more on our heme block. I'll get to that in our heme block, but just know that. And finally, neurotube defects are related to folate deficiency. That's why we always give folate to our pregnant women. And if they're at high risk for neurotube defects, we give them like 10 times as much folate. One thing you do need to know is that folate deficiency is not associated with any neuro symptoms. That's folate. Let's move on to cobalamin. From ingestion, goes to your stomach, binds to intrinsic factor, into your intestines, where it's absorbed in your ileum. So if you have your ileum resected for things like Crohn's or what have you, or you have something wrong with your stomach, atrophic, just chronic inflammation, or if it's autoimmune, pernicious anemia, you can have B12 cobalamin deficiency. Good. How else can you be deficient in it? Didn't I say it was only found in animal sources? So if you're a vegan, something rare is if you have something called fish tapeworm. Tapeworm. Very long name. I just call it D. latum. Just remember the latum part of it. The D part of it is like 20 letters. It's in my notes if you want to know it. If you want to be a keen gunner. So that's B12 cobalamin. One of the things it shares with folate is that if you're deficient in it, you get megaloblastic anemia. However, there's something distinct. Cobalamin makes something from fatty acids and amino acids called succinyl-CoA. Succinyl-CoA will eventually go on to form heme. Again, it's important, heme synthesis and blood synthesis. It'll also go on to make some TCA stuff and myelin. So where folate doesn't have neurosymptoms, this should say no neurosymptoms, B12 does. So if a patient comes in with megaloblastic anemia, you can't really tell the difference. However, if you give them folate because you're thinking they're folate deficiency, but they have really strong neurosymptoms and that neurosymptom doesn't disappear, then it's actually B12 deficiency. So know that B12 has neurosymptoms. Very, very important. So folate and cobalamin deficiency can look very similar. We don't just give them one or the other and then see by process of elimination what they have. That's not an effective way to do things. Instead, we use labs. And labs is a great way of telling us whether a patient is folate deficient or cobalamin deficient. Here's how we do it. The folate in the form of tetrahydrofolate can be made via tetrahydrofolate CH3 and our good friend B12 cobalamin. That's why we say cobalamin and folate go together. Here you see them go together. This is done with the help of homocysteine. And homocysteine helps out and in turn gets turned into methionine. If you're deficient in these two enzymes, then you're not going to be able to turn homocysteine into methionine. So homocysteine levels are going to rise. You're probably thinking if we have increased homocysteine levels, that still doesn't tell us whether it's B12 or folate. That just tells us it's one or the other. So we need to add another test, and that is testing cobalamin's ability to make succinyl-CoA. Succinyl-CoA comes from fatty acids and amino acids, in particular odd chain fatty acids. That turns into methyl-malonyl-CoA, and via B12 cobalamin turns into succinyl-CoA, and that makes your heme, TCA, myelin. If you don't have B12, you'll have elevated methyl-malonyl-CoA. And using these two labs, we're able to differentiate whether it's folate deficiency or cobalamin deficiency. Understand? Let's see if you really understand. If a person has increased homocysteine, but normal methyl-malonyl-CoA, what does the patient lack? Well, they have normal methyl-malonyl-CoA. That means their B12 is fine. That means they lack folate. How about if they have elevated homocysteine and elevated methylmalonyl-CoA? That means they lack B12. It is that easy. That does it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.